Hello and welcome once again to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, monetary policy versus fiscal policy. Which one works best when it comes to controlling inflation, keeping unemployment in check, and avoiding a recession? Or do either of them really work at all? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Now, Steve, central banks like to control inflation using monetary theory, in other words, working on the cost of borrowing as their way to control inflation and unemployment and to avoid recessions. Whereas Keynes, and Steve Keen, I think, as well, he argues that government spending is the way to avoid recessions, to pump prime the economy. And she'll be right, mate. So first of all, Steve, does monetary theory work?
Yeah, it works beautifully well for central banks who want to employ conventional economists. Unfortunately, it doesn't work at all well for the economy. I think in this sense, we've had one of probably the best empirical tests of a theory you could ever hope for, because really since the late 1980s, maybe even earlier than that, the neoclassical emphasis on trying to reject fiscal policy and say the government should do nothing to control the economy whatsoever, left it with one thing they said it should do, which is to control interest rates. And this is the whole idea of, I think it's called the Taylor rule, after the mainstream economists who first suggested that this is what central banks have been doing, so let's make it policy. And then this policy, though it never actually explicitly adopted, turned up in the equations that mainstream economists used to model the economy. So what Taylor realized was that if you look at the decisions of central banks over time, it had been set with a target inflation rate of about 2%. And there was the number 2 turned up several times in the simple equation, but they would be influenced also between the gap between what they called actual output and potential output. In other words, the output level that would apply if full employment applied, and the rate of change of inflation. And this Taylor rule was seen as they never explicitly, well, some central banks did explicitly say we're following it, but most of them didn't explicitly say we're doing it, but all the models that their economists put together had the Taylor rule as the one variable that the government was allowed to control, and that was all in the hand of central banks, who were staffed by neoclassical economists, and the central banks were independent of the politicians, and it was all supposed to be absolutely hunky-dory and lead to a lovely, stable capitalist system.
Right. But there is a relationship, isn't there, between inflation and the level of unemployment, though? Or do you say that they're not related to each other?
This comes back to the argument of the Phillips Curve, which is somewhat tangential, but yes, it's part of the argument is that the level of employment will change how much workers can demand wage rises. And literally every theory of economics, to some degree, has this. You go right back to Karl Marx, you get a similar argument that workers' capacity to bargain for wage rises depends upon the level of employment. But it became, this is a whole other rabbit hole. You like going down rabbit holes, though, don't you?
Yeah, we do. We always do.
Stop me when... and this rabbit hole was one of the greatest and most misinterpreted economists of all time was a New Zealander called Bill Phillips. And Bill Phillips was actually an engineer by training, and quite a brilliant engineer. To give you an idea of how brilliant he was, and this is all taken from his biography written by an Australian economist called Robert Leeson. At one stage, Phillips was captured during the Second World War by the Japanese, interred on a Japanese prisoner of war camp, which happened to be an island. On the island, he found a derelict bus, which he spent his spare time trying to turn into a boat to escape. That plan didn't particularly get anywhere, but at one point, all the British prisoners were enjoying it, and as one should, a nice hot cup of tea. And the nice hot cup of tea was being generated by components that Phillips had stolen from the commandant's office, which meant he could actually tap into the electricity system of the camp and seal some of it to heat up tea for the inmates. And he also even managed to put together a functional radio system so that they could listen to broadcasts, not the propaganda of the Japanese about how well the war was going for them, but radio broadcasts from shortwave, obviously, from the BBC and other sources, giving rather more accurate reports of what was happening. Back in the day when BBC actually gave accurate reports.
No, right, in those good old days.
This is that's the old days. So this fabulous man, retrained to become an economist, economist, and he applied his ideas of engineering and circuit diagrams, basically the same sort of stuff that I design in Minsky these days. He designed those, applied those ideas to build a model of the economy, which had as part of that model, and only as one particular component, an argument that what he called factor incomes, not just wages, but incomes of capitalists, incomes of raw materials producers and so on, their prices would rise with the rising level of economic activity. And he literally hand drew a little curve there, which was non-linear, so it tapered to zero at basically like a hyperbola. It went flat and then it went vertical when you had high levels of employment. And then to actually try to put this, to go from having just a hand drawing to something based on data, he went back to data from the UK from 1863 to 1917, I think it was, assembled a whole lot of data on the unemployment rate and the rate of wage change by looking at union data, because at that stage the government did not collect this information. The unions were the only ones who knew how many people were out of work in the UK. And using that data curve designed from, as I said, I think 1863 to 1917, he then interpolated it to data from 1953, I think from somewhere around 50s to the 60s, and it fitted the actual current data like a glove. Now, he made a fatal mistake in saying it looks like we've got a menu choice here. If we want full employment of, say 3% of the people out of work in the UK, which would be regarded as frictional unemployment, then we need a rate of inflation of 4%. And if you want to have zero, if you want to have zero wage change, you need an unemployment rate of 5%, like a menu choice. And politicians saw this and said, oh, great, this is simple. We just say, well, what do we want? Do we want the spicy menu with low unemployment and slightly high inflation? Or do you want the bland menu with higher unemployment but no inflation? We can make a choice between the two, and it will stay there.
Right.
And this became the way the Phillips Curve is interpreted, completely misinterpreting the idea behind it. And also forgetting the part that he said it was non-linear. So all this stuff turns up now in so-called modern dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. They have an equation which implies that by varying the rate of interest, you can vary the level of economic activity, and by varying that, you vary the rate of inflation. So you can hit this sweet spot, which they're always aiming for. This is where my argument, you can summarise their theories in three numbers. They want a 2% rate of inflation, a 3% rate of real economic growth, and a 4% rate of interest, giving you a nominal rate, giving you a 2% real rate. That's their target. And this is what they thought they could do by monetary policy.
Right. So there is a lot more to this discussion with Professor Steve Keen, but you're listening to the truncated version of this interview. There's another 20 minutes or so, in fact 25 minutes of this interview still to go, where he'll explain more about why monetary theory is just wrong and how far can we go with fiscal policy. Well, tune into the full version. To hear that, you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Choose one of the subscription plans on the right-hand side, or become a supporter of Steve on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. And if you provide $10 or more support each month to go towards Steve's work, then you'll get access to this and all the other podcasts in the series. We're coming up to episode 100 in a couple of episodes' time, but there's loads more for you to listen to in the back catalogue, and all future ones as well, so there's no reason not to subscribe. Hopefully we'll see you back here again soon. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.